Globální oteplování je skutečné, je způsobené člověkem a je to velký, velký problém. Ale není to konec světa. Přestaňme se bavit o tom, že snížíme CO2. Přestaňme se bavit o těchto krocích. Zaměřme se na rozvoj zelených energií. Investujme do vývoje. To udělejme a uděláme to možná věc, která je vůbec nejlepší. Říká muž, který je dnes šéfem Copenhagen Consensus Center. Je to autor slavné a doslova a do písmene světem obletěné knihy Skeptický ekolog a také knihy Cool It, která byla i sfilmována. Je to muž, který byl v roce 2004 magazínem Time označen za jednoho ze 100 nejvlivnějších mužů planety. V roce 2008 to byl jeden z 50 lidí, kteří mohou zachránit tento svět, alespoň podle britského Guardianu. A v roce 2010 to byl jeden ze 100 globálních myslitelů podle Foreign Policy. Letos je to muž, který říká, cituji, Pařížská klimatická dohoda nevyřeší nic a bude nás stát miliardy. Celou dobu je to Bjørn Lomborg. Welcome. We will definitely talk about your opinions. I just would like to join you in something that is very specific and that is pretty unique for this presentation, because Mr. Lomborg is giving speeches all over the world. That's absolutely clear. He's a world star and world-recognized expert on climate change. But for you, he has prepared something special. He decided that because of Ostrava, he will take his shoes off. You can check it out. Could we make a comparison to everybody know that I'm not lying? So, barefooted, here for you in Ostrava.
Thank you.
Lomborg, the floor is yours.
Can we bring down the... Brilliant, thank you. I don't want to scare everyone. So, all right, I worry a little bit about the fact that we're all the way to the bottom. Sorry, we're going to see all my slides, but from behind. So, I want to just give you like 20 minutes of sense of why it is I'm arguing that a lot of what we try to do with global warming is actually not very effective. So let's get our priorities straight, and that's really what I want to talk about here today, and then Daniel and I will have a discussion, and I hope everyone will join in and have some questions on some of these issues. So look, most of the concern that we have on environment really is on global warming, and it's absolutely true. It is real, it's man-made, it is an important problem, so let's just get that out of the way. But it's also important to have a sense of proportion. It is significant, it'll have a negative impact in the long run. We estimate, and this is the UN Climate Panel, the IPCC, tells us that the impact right now, if you measure it in terms of GDP, is about 0%. So right now, global warming has disbenefits and benefits, and they're about the same. In the long run, the cost will escalate, and it'll get to about 0.2 to 2% of GDP in the 2070s. Again, this is the UN Climate Panel. So it gives you a sense of proportion. It's not a huge issue now. It will be a significant issue, but it's also important to get a sense of proportion. It's probably about the equivalent of 1 year of recession over the next 60 years. So not the end of the world, but certainly something we want to talk about. But also, let's just have a sense of, we get the sense that it's the end of the world. This, I don't know if you remember, this is the picture from Tacloban in the Philippines, where about 5,000 people died in 2013 from a hurricane that hit, Hurricane Haiyan. And a lot of people blamed this on global warming and said, this is the kind of thing that we're going to see more and more of from global warming. But I think we fail to remember how many things we've actually fixed. Let me just show you something which I think you'll probably find somewhat surprising. These are the deaths from climate catastrophes from 1930 till today. This is the best data that we have from the International Disaster Database. It's hosted in Belgium. It's the one that Al Gore and almost everyone else use. This are the numbers. We've actually seen a dramatic decline in the total number of people dying. Now, this does not mean that global warming will not probably mean more ferocious hurricanes. Probably fewer hurricanes, but probably more ferocious hurricanes. But it's incredibly important to get a sense of proportion. Actually, because we're richer and because we're better able to deal with many of the problems, we've seen a dramatic decline from more than 400,000 people dying per year from climate-related catastrophes to now about 25,000. That's not what you hear. We will have probably many more of these arguments. I'd love to show you many, many more of these graphs, but I'm just going to try and keep this to 20 minutes. So let's just move on and point out that a lot of what you hear in global warming is not the full sense of the story. Yes, global warming is a problem, but remember, actually, if you look at climate-related disasters, we've actually seen fewer and fewer people dying. And remember, despite the fact that we're many, many more people today than we used to be. So the simple argument is, in some way, look, if CO2 is a problem, CO2 comes from fossil fuels. Why don't we just get rid of all that stuff? Why don't we just stop using fossil fuels? It's a very alluring argument, and a lot of people make it these days. But the problem is, of course, we don't burn fossil fuels to annoy Al Gore or to annoy the environmentalists. We don't burn fossil fuels to make global warming. It's a side effect of doing all the stuff that makes it worthwhile having a civilization. I mean, I like having dry feet, but actually, we like pretty much all of the stuff that we get. We get heat, cold, transport, food, electricity, pretty much everything we get from the power that's provided mostly by fossil fuels. And so to get a sense of proportion, it gives us the power that we never had before. Matt Ridley, in his book, The Irrational Optimist, he asks the slightly odd question, why was it fun to be Louis XIV? Right. Assuming it was fun to be Louis XIV, the answer, in many ways, is he had lots and lots of servants, right? He had people to do everything for him. That must be pretty cool. Of course, the problem with that setup is only one guy gets to be king and a lot of people gets to be slaves. But what fossil fuels actually achieve for us to do is now that we all have the same power. Actually, the average European, because of all the fossil fuel energy we use, have the equivalent power of 150 people. Each one of you have the power of 150 people at your disposal every hour of the day, every day of the week. Yes, Americans have more, Indians have less, but the point here is we've all gotten much, much more ability because we have fossil fuels. Now, that doesn't mean we can't get rid of fossil fuels and go entirely green energy. And in the long run, that is how we need to do it. But we also need to recognize the reason why it's so hard to stop is because it actually provides us with all the stuff that makes civilization fun. So let me get to what we're trying to do right now. Well, everybody talks about we're going to go green. Let's get a sense of proportion. These are the numbers. These are the latest numbers from the International Energy Agency. So pretty much it's the OECD for energy. It's the one that pretty much everybody trusts is the best source for energy data. This is the energy distribution in the last year that they've done for 2013. Notice pretty much everything comes from coal, oil, and gas. A little nuclear, a little hydro. Biomass is huge. Biomass is basically poor people using wood, dung, cardboard, whatever they can get their hands on to cook and keep warm. This is a poverty phenomenon mostly. And then all the stuff that we talk about, wind, solar, negligible. Actually, we get right now about 0.5% of global energy from solar and wind. Now, all of us have this idea that, but surely, very, very quickly, we're going to move to a world where we'll have lots of solar, lots of wind. And that's just simply not true. If you assume, and this is what the International Energy Agency does, if you assume that everybody's going to do everything they promised in Paris last year when we all did that wonderful climate agreement that I'll talk about in a little bit, and where we all promised to fix global warming, if you assume everybody will do that, which of course is a big if, then this is what it's going to look in 2040, so 24 years from now. We'll have more coal, more gas, more oil, more nuclear, more hydro, more biomass. Yes, we'll also have more wind and we'll have more solar. But notice how little more wind and how little more solar. Actually, just to give you a sense of proportion, we'll have we right now have 0.4% wind. We'll get all the way up to 1.7% wind. And solar is 0.1% globally, and we'll get all the way up to 0.7%. So in 2040, the world will get 2.2% of its energy from solar and wind. Solar and wind is not going to solve global warming anytime soon. This sucks to hear because we all want to believe, oh, put up a wind turbine and we're all good. But that's not the solution in the short or in the medium term. It possibly will be in the long run. I'll get back to that. But right now, we need to face the music and realize this is not actually going to solve the problem anytime soon. And so I want to talk about the climate policies that we've done so far, the Rio, the Kyoto, now the Paris Agreement, the one that we entered into last year, or at least promised that we were going to do last year. We'll see how well that moves. I want to do a little bit more technical stuff, and I apologize for it, but it's actually fairly understandable because it's also incredibly useful to see what will this actually do. I've done the only peer-reviewed article studying how much will Paris actually do. You're pretty surprised, right? I mean, given that this is something that we've actually decided to spend a lot of money on, shouldn't we at least have a sense of how much is this actually going to do? Well, let me show you. It'll have a tiny impact. And let me show you this. It's going to get a little technical, but not all that much. On the left-hand side here, I'm going to show you the emissions. So how much CO2 do we put out? So we start in 2000, and it ends in 2100. So basically, we're going to look here, how many gigatons or billion tons of CO2 do we emit every year in the world? Well, we already know what we have done. These are the historical emissions. We can't do anything about them. What will happen in the future? Well, there's a lot of business as usual scenarios. This is the UN's own, the UNEP's own business as usual scenario. So we'll keep emitting more and more CO2 if we don't do anything about global warming, which is not very surprising. More people want to get rich. More people want to have more power. So what will this do? How much temperature rise will this give rise to? Well, that's very easy. We can just run this through a climate model. I've used the MAGIC climate model, the one that the UN used for all its IPCC reports, the one that the US EPA, so the Environmental Protection Agency, has helped sponsor. So it's a totally standard climate model. This is how much temperature is going to increase. So as you can see, in temperature in degrees centigrade, from 2000, we're about 0.7 degrees above. By the end of the century, we're going to be almost up to 4 degrees centigrade. So a significant temperature rise. This is why global warming is real, and it is important. 4 degrees warmer is actually not a particularly good place to be. So we want to do something about it. But let's take a look at what we've actually promised. So how much has Paris promised? Paris has promised to cut this much in CO2. It's promised to cut this bit of emissions. This is what all the nations of the world have promised. If everyone does everything they promised, remember, we've never done that with any climate treaty ever. But let's just assume that we actually do everything we promised. This is what we promised. It's the Paris Promise. It's 56 gigatons, or 56 billion tons of CO2 in total. If you look at that reduction and run it through the same climate model, you can get what's the resultant temperature rise. And look very closely over there. This is the difference. Sorry, I should just put on the 56 up there. This is the difference in temperature rise. Oh, wait. You actually can't tell the difference, right? Now, there's a new graph. It's slightly lower. It's actually 0.04 degrees lower by the end of the century. So if everyone in the world does everything they promised in Paris, we will see a negligible impact by the end of the century. This is not something you can debate. This is simply the outcome of the models. Now, I understand a lot of people don't want to hear this, and I understand a lot of people don't want to see this, and that's why there's no other peer-reviewed studies that have done this, because it's not a convenient result, but that doesn't mean it goes away. Now, of course, you could argue, well, maybe we can do more. Let's assume that we not only do Paris, but that we continue that promise for the rest of the century. Remember, none of the nations have actually done that. For instance, the US was very explicit. They only made a promise till 2025. And of course, they don't have Congress approval for that. The Chinese, likewise. The Europeans, a little bit more mushy about that. But let's just assume we do everything for the rest of the century. That's an extended Paris promise. That'll cut 540 gigatons of CO2. Run that through the model, and you get this. You get a slightly lower. Now we're actually starting to see a little bit of reduction. We see a reduction of 0.18 degrees, but it's literally not going to be noticeable in 100 years. Why is it then that you've heard much, much higher temperature reductions? Well, that's because you've heard people saying, but we're going to be much, much better than the Paris Agreement. This is the typical standard scenario. The Climate Action Tracker, this is what they're assuming. They're actually assuming, and this is what they've been widely quoted by pretty much everyone, they're assuming we're going to cut more sooner, and then remember, we're going to cut enormously more towards the end of the century. So this is much, much more than Paris. They're actually assuming we'll cut about 3,000 gigatons of CO2. So notice, they're actually saying, yeah, Paris will cut 56 gigatons, but then we're going to cut about 98% more for the rest of the century. And then you get this temperature reduction over here. 1.1 degrees reduction. That's a significant reduction. But also notice, it's total fantasy. By now, nobody has promised 98% of this. And of course, we're now talking about we want to get to 2 degrees. 2 degrees requires this. This is the UNEP, the UN Environmental Program estimate for 2 degrees. A lot of them, they look pretty similar. That would require us to cut 6,000 gigatons of CO2. So remember, right now, people are all thrilled up about the fact that we possibly promised to cut 56 gigatons. And then we are hoping we'll get to 6,000 gigatons. We are literally talking about 1% of getting to 2 degrees. That's why I'm arguing we talk a lot about feeling good on climate change, but it's actually not doing very much. And now, of course, if this didn't cost very much either, maybe we'd want to do this. But let's just have a sense of what's the cost of Paris. It's phenomenal. This is, again, the IEA estimate of how much we spend just on subsidies for solar and wind and the other green energy technologies. Notice that we're spending about $160 billion right now, and we're probably going to end up tackling $250 billion per year. That's a lot of money. And this is only in the subsidy. We're also going to see dramatic increases in reduction of GDP. We can possibly talk about that later. It has real costs, because if you make energy more expensive, because energy is what drives pretty much the whole economy, you're simply making us grow less. If you look at this is data for last 20 years from World Bank. If you put growth rate out this way and CO2 growth up this way, there's a very strong correlation. If you're China, if you grow a lot, you also grow your CO2 a lot. If you are Denmark or Italy, you only grow a little, and you possibly even have a negative growth of CO2. Yes, you can grow less CO2, or you can even reduce your CO2, but it also has real costs. If you run this through the biggest models, they typically come from the Stanford Energy Modeling Forum, then you get a sense of the cost of the Paris promises. Again, it's amazing to me that nobody has done this. We will get this in a couple of years, but right now, these are estimates of models that have actually been used for other things. This is the cost of Paris. Sorry. This is the average of the best energy economic models, as I said, from Stanford and from some of the other period models. They estimate that for the US, the cost, if well implemented, that's typically through a carbon tax, is $154 billion a year. For the EU, it's about $300 billion. So that means about 13,000 coronas for each one of you guys for every year. Sorry, yes, thanks. So a lot of money. China, about $200 billion. Mexico is the only other one. That's the only developing country estimate that we have. And then if we do a linear assessment for the rest of the world, it's $155 billion. So the total cost is close to $1 trillion a year. This is if everybody does the most effective promises. We never seen that ever before. We have lots of studies that show that typically climate policies are about twice as costly. And so if you just double all these, you get about $2 trillion. So the real cost is the climate policies that we promised in Paris are going to cost between $1 and $2 trillion a year. Remember, that's about 10 to 20 times as much as the total development budget. It's 1 to 2% of global GDP. That's not a trivial cost. Now, if it fixed global warming, maybe it'd be a good idea, but it doesn't. It fixes almost nothing for an incredible amount of money. It's the world's most costly target ever. Just to give you a sense of proportion, the Versailles Treaty, which was probably the most costly treaty ever in history before this climate treaty, is estimated to cost about $500 billion in today's money in total. So it's the cost of 1/4 of the Versailles Treaty every year. So which climate policies do work, and then I'll shut up and we can get to the questions. Look, there are 3 ways that we can really solve global warming. If you look at the 2008 financial crisis, that actually really did work. We reduced carbon emissions dramatically. So had that crisis been longer, had it been more expensive, we would, for instance, actually have achieved the Kyoto target. So a recession is a good way to get reductions. Of course, many people don't feel particularly good about this. Most politicians don't feel they can sell that as a good argument. I don't think it's a very good argument either. So it's unlikely that we're going to see recession as a prominent way to solve global warming. The other way is to look at cutting emissions with technology. That's what the EU is doing. If you look at all the EU wind and solar, it probably cuts about 100 megatons of CO2 annually. Look at what America has achieved by going from coal to shale gas. So that's essentially the fracking revolution that's taken place in the US that has made gas much, much cheaper, and hence provided a dramatic shift away from coal towards gas. This matters because gas emits about half as much CO2 per energy unit as coal does. So the US shale gas has actually cut almost 3 times as much. And remember, whereas the EU pays about $40 billion in subsidies each year, the US has probably made about $300 billion more per year, simply because they improve their competition, they improve their economy. So technology is really the only simple way to solve this problem. That's why we've found that investment in green R&D, make sure that future green technologies get much, much cheaper, is a much better investment. We suggest we should be spending about $100 billion globally. That's 10 times what the world is spending right now. This is what Bill Gates and many, many others argued at the Paris Agreement. And actually, we got governments to sign on to doubling, so we're now going from 10 to 20, but we could still do much better. And it also has a much, much better opportunity to solve global warming in the medium term. If you look at this, and this is a very rough estimate, we estimate that the EU climate policy right now, for every dollar it spends, or for every euro, or for every kroner it spends, it does 3 cents of climate damage. It reduces climate damage by 3 cents in the long run future. That's a very poor investment. If you invest it in green research and development, every dollar or every euro, every krona spent would do $11 or euros or krona per dollar spent. Sorry, I think I just repeated myself there. The last thing I just want to say is a lot of people worry a lot about global warming, and that's great. It's wonderful that people really worry about the world. But I'm just so surprised. Why is it we don't talk about all the other issues? What's the world's biggest environmental problem? Just, what do you think it is? Water? Sorry? I'm sorry, I can't hear you. Land use change, yep. If you just look at, I mean, most people actually, if you just ask them, will say global warming, but I think you kind of knew that that was not where I was going. If you just look at the number of dead, these are the studies that we have from the Global Burden of Disease, so the World Health Organization. By far the biggest killer in the world is indoor air pollution. Wow. Sorry about that. Indoor air pollution is essentially 3 billion people cooking and keeping warm using dirty fuels, mostly wood. Outdoor air pollution is the second biggest, then lead, then water and sanitation, as you mentioned, then ozone, then global warming. Global warming, the World Health Organization estimate, kills about 140,000 people right now, and then radon. And even by 2050, we estimate, this is again the World Health Organization, estimates it'll kill about 250,000 people. It's not trivial by any means, but it's also surprising we don't care more about these big, big killers, right? Especially indoor air pollution, which is mostly poverty. And of course, if you look at what does poverty kill, that's much, much more. Remember, there's some double counting here because there's certainly not some of those people who die from poverty also die from indoor air pollution. We estimate about 18 million people die from poverty, or about a third of everyone who dies on the planet. The UN actually asked everyone, what are the biggest issues for you? They asked them 16 different things. One of them was global warming. They asked them, could you please rank what do you think is most important? I doubt most of you have seen it because it's not a very convenient result for the UN, and they've actually sort of hidden it away now. But this is the outcome of the world's biggest survey made by the UN on what do you people worry about. The top priority was education, then health, then jobs, then no corruption, nutrition, no violence, clean water and sanitation, support for people who can't work, better infrastructure, equality, reliable energy, no discrimination, public freedom, protect forests, rivers, and oceans, phone and internet. And at the very last came action on climate change. If you ask people, it's not very surprising. Of course, if you're starving, if your kids are dying, if they don't have a good education, if you have corruption, if you don't get good food, those are your top priorities. And there's something phenomenal about the way that we only focus on global warming. This does not mean we're an advanced civilization. We can both focus on these things and on global warming. But there's something phenomenal about the way we only focus on global warming or only talk about this one issue. That's why we work together, and we'll probably talk more about that, on where can you actually do the most good. We've looked, and I'm just showing you this. There's no way you can overlook all of this. I'm going to talk about that tomorrow here at the Ostrava Festival as well. But where can you spend money and help the world the most? Let's have that conversation. And unfortunately, it's not on the current climate policies. There are some smart climate policies. Invest in research and development and green energy does a lot of good. But then let's also remember there are lots and lots of other issues that we should fix first. So with that, I'm going to stop, and I'll hand it over to a conversation. I'll look very much forward to hear your questions. Thank you.
Můžete se ptát v češtině, není potřeba, abyste se ptali v angličtině, jenom mi prosím dejte najevo, že se chcete ptát a dostanete hned mikrofon. Mikrofon je potřeba, aby slyšeli i tlumočníci, kteří pro vás tlumočí, a kolegyně potom přepisuje to, co říká váš dnešní host v angličtině. Do you consider yourself to be an expert?
I think I'm an intellectual entrepreneur in the sense that I try to get some of the smartest people together and thinking about these issues. So very clearly, if you want to use the expert, I'm an expert in getting a lot of other experts to look across a wide range of areas and say, where can you do the most good? So that's mostly what we do with economists.
In other words, you are not climate change expert?
Oh, God, no.
No? Are there any?
Sorry?
Are there any?
Oh, yeah, I mean, look.
Who are those you follow as climate experts?
Sorry?
Who are those you follow? Give me a few names, for example.
Oh, no, look, I take my starting point in the UN climate panel. I think they do a great job. They really try to outline all the best science that we have on climate. So there are definitely, literally hundreds, probably thousands of people who've contributed to this work. For instance, the model that I used, the MAGIC model, is the work of probably 20 climate scientists through 10 years. So clearly, lots of people have spent a lot of time looking at this. The point and the little thing that I try to add to this conversation is nobody seems to want to answer the politically useful but slightly annoying questions like, for instance, how much does Paris help? Or how much does Paris cost? There are lots of people who've looked at bits and pieces of it, but the outcome is very inconvenient, and that's why I think it's sort of left to people like me to sort of pick up those pieces and try to piece them together and say, there's a good argument that this is not actually going to do very much.
Okay, you are the guy who put people together, who prepare these figures, and you are the communicator. Am I right?
Yeah.
Okay. Are you happy with that?
I don't know. I mean, I think it's.
Are you?
Yeah. I mean, I like putting these numbers together because I think it's crucial that we have someone to do this. But I would so much more like this to be something that happened automatically, for instance, in the IPCC, the UN Climate Panel. Back in 2010, I don't know if you remember, there were a lot of challenges. They predicted all the glaciers in the Himalaya would have disappeared, and it turned out that that was not the case. There was a lot of other problems. The interagency based in Holland actually did a report where they suggested a lot of changes to how the IPCC is doing their reports. Unfortunately, none of them were implemented, and those are some of the things, do much more policy-relevant work and also do much more, not what is convenient, but what is true, if you will.
I'm asking this question to sum up everything that was happening around the skeptical ecologists, everything that was happening around, for example, the University of Western Australia or Flinders University academics who said that you are infamous for your views on climate change, for example, and they rejected the cooperation. That's why I'm asking if you are an expert or you are a communicator. Are there any questions? Chcete se na něco zeptat? Klidně se ptejte. Jak jsem zmiňoval, můžete v češtině. Prosím, poprosím, mikrofon jenom předáme tady doprava. Já zaběhnu za vámi. Ptejte se, prosím.
Hi, my name is Alish, and I just have a brief question about the assumptions that go into the models, especially when comparing climate change to the other causes out there. Do you focus on the default outcomes from climate change, which is mostly the case when comparing it to other causes, or do you also take into account the sort of right-tail catastrophic risks that some people warn about from climate change, such as the work from Marty Weitzman? This is the first question, and also a subsequent question. Do you think it would change the math significantly if you counted the catastrophic risks? And question number two, how do you get people to listen to the data?
How do you get people?
People to listen to the data as opposed to intuition.
So the first one, the idea which you're alluding to is Weissman's argument that there's a fat tail, that there's a, maybe most of the outcomes of global warming are not all that bad, but it could get really, really bad. Now, if you take that into account, his argument is that in principle, you actually end up with an anomaly because it turns out that you need to spend everything on climate change, and there's been a huge economic discussion. And I think, fundamentally, Nordhaus did a very strong critique of this. He pointed out, look, you can do this for a lot of different things. You can do this for, Iran getting nuclear weapons, or for our fear of nanoparticles, or, asteroids, or all these other things. And it turns out that with this sort of formulation, you need to spend all your money on all of these problems, and of course you can't do it multiple times. So there's a logical inconsistency. But if you take a more sort of relaxed argument and simply say, what about really huge risks? Those would tend to increase your want to do something about global warming. They've actually typically, it's a discussion that we've had for 10 years. So they have been included, for instance, in Nordhaus models and many others. They've only been included, if you will, parametrically. So we don't know very well, but that's, of course, the basis of this point. We don't actually know what the real risks are. The other point that I think is crucial is, even if you take into account a huge amount of risk, yes, you would increase, for instance, your carbon tax or how much you do, but what you can do right now in the next 10 or 20 years is very, very little, because what those numbers up there show is, even if you do a lot, even if you do much, much more than what we promised in Paris, it'll change the risk factor very, very little, because it'll change the temperature very little. So really what you do need to do is to make changes to technology, and that's then getting back to my point. So really, if you take this into account, it'll change some of the parameters slightly, but it'll really not make a huge difference. It still shows you should do the much smarter priorities, like, for instance, investing in research and development. How do you get people to listen to data? I think fundamentally that's one of the big problems we have in the world, and I don't think there's a good argument. I mean, you could sort of slightly facetiously say, the Brexit and Donald Trump and that sort of thing shows that this is incredibly hard to do. And again, I would probably say I see my argument as a little bit trying to push us in the slightly more correct direction, or what we normally say at the Copenhagen Consensus, the think tank that I run. This is not about getting it right, it's about getting it slightly less wrong.
One of the outcomes that you can have from the book or film Kool-Aid is that you are saying that, for example, people like Al Gore are using fear, are trying to make the impression that we are supposed to be scared, that fear is the emotion. What kind of emotion do you use? You can persuade people?
Well, I hope I try to make rationality, and that's of course why I'm losing, because fear is just a much stronger emotion than rationality. But I think also most people actually want to do good. I mean, I think that's a strong part of the reason why global warming has this grip on our imagination. We want to make sure that we leave the world a better place. And so I just want to make sure that we do the things that will actually end up making the world a much better place, and not just spending lots of money making the world an infinitesimally better place. Let's be smart.
Was the question answered? Slightly. Is it okay? The difference, slightly. Okay. There was one more question I could see. Prosím vás, jestli můžete podat mikrofon. Děkuji moc. Pošlete prosím po vaší levé ruce a prosím, ptejte se.
Dobrý den, Ondřej. Já se vrátím k tomu grafu, kde bylo těch 16 největších světových problémů, a chtěl jsem se zeptat, jestli to nelze brát tak, že ty klimatické změny nebo ta rizika těch klimatických změn jsou vlastně příčinou těch mnohem důležitějších problémů, tak jak to vnímají ti lidé. Děkuji.
Yep. I'm relying on translation, so you have to tell me if I'm wrong.
They would find out because
yes,
of your
we'll
answer,
find out. Yes. So a lot of people point out, for instance, if you have more global warming, you're going to see more malaria, for instance, or more dengue. You're going to see more hurricanes, or no, probably not, but you're going to see more ferocious hurricanes. You're going to see a lot of other damages, and that was your point, I believe. What if global warming actually affects all these other problems? So possibly it'll also lead to less nutrition. Possibly it'll also lead to more infectious disease and so on. So is global warming actually the thing that dominates all these others because it affects everything? There is some truth to that. So global warming does affect all of these. Rather smallly. I mean, we've looked, for instance, malaria is one of the strongest things. Malaria is slightly dependent on temperature, but it's hugely dependent on poverty. So fundamentally, if you're poor, you get malaria, you often die from malaria. If you're not poor, you rarely get malaria, and if you get malaria, you don't die from malaria. But the point is, all the other 15 also affect the impact of global warming. One of the statistics I tried to show you was how much less damage, that is, how many fewer deaths we have from climate-related impacts over the last 80 years, right, from 1930. And that's mostly because we've gotten richer, because we've gotten better infrastructure, because we've gotten better educated. So you have better communication, you're better able to tell people, for instance, to move if a hurricane comes along. You have better infrastructure so you don't actually get these huge floodings that would kill 1 million people in China or in somewhere in Asia. So the point is, likewise, all the other impacts, all the other things I showed up there, like education and in some way the underlying avoid poverty, are also drivers on how much climate change is actually going to impact us. You're again going to die a lot more from heat waves if you don't have air conditioning than you are if you do have air conditioning, if you want to put it sort of very bluntly. So the reality here is, what I tried to show you is actual numbers of what we believe are going to be the impact if you have more global warming. That's probably about 250,000 people die each year. But also, how many people are going to die from indoor air pollution right now? 4.3 million people. And that's simply because they're poor. If you avoid poverty, you will both get a reduction in the number of people who die from indoor air pollution because it'll stop burning wood inside. But you'll also get a reduction in the vulnerability to climate change. Remember, everybody points out that the poor are the most vulnerable to climate change. That's exactly true. So the real question that often faces us is, do you want to help a future poor person by cutting CO2, which will mean that they will have slightly lower increased temperatures by the end of the century? Or do you want to help that person by pulling that person out of poverty, which means that they'll be a lot less vulnerable to climate change, but also to infectious diseases and all the other things. And that's where the numbers overwhelmingly show us that we actually can do much, much better if we focus on infectious disease and on nutrition and these many, many other things, education included.
Zodpovězená otázka? Doplňte.
Pořád jde mi o to, že prostě vliv třeba, když bychom brali sucho, voda, jo, tak prostě se natolik vlastně jako změní klima, zhorší se prostě podmínky na Zemi, že prostě podle mě je jenom, jako mi ten graf nepřipadá jako tak výmluvný, jo, že vlastně jakoby vy to předkládáte, že to je nejmenší problém, ale on ten problém prostě je vlastně jakoby mnohem závažnější. Ale se těžko asi vyjadřuju.
Yeah. Okay. There is no, because doing this, I mean, we've tried to do some of this, doing this correctly in the sense that, you know, how much does global warming matter? How much does water matter? How much does it, that would actually require us to have a global model. And we don't, a global model of everything. We don't have that. So we only have partial models for all of these. But let me give you one example that could somehow illustrate this. If you look at the impact, because we have very, very good data on climate. So if we don't do anything about climate, as I pointed out, the UN estimate in the 2070s, we will have a cost of all damages from global warming plus all the benefits from global warming, which will be much smaller, we'll have a total damage cost of somewhere between 0.2 and 2% of GDP. The world GDP, global GDP, yes. Compare this to the impacts of, for instance, infectious disease, which is easily in the 10s or the 20s of percent of GDP. Compare this to the impact of air pollution, which is in about 16% of global GDP. Compare this to the impact of free trade, for instance, which is one of the basic ways to pull people out of poverty, which, if you go to the 2070s, could easily be 600, 800% of GDP. All of these numbers dwarf global warming. So if you just take it one by one, now your question is more complicated than that because you also want to take a look at what's the marginal change if I do something with global warming versus what's the marginal change if I do something, for instance, for infectious disease. We don't know the numbers well enough to tell you that straight up. I mean, we could sit here for a very long time and I could give you indicators why that's the case, but I've tried to give you the absolute size, and that certainly seems to indicate global warming is by no means the biggest impact of what's going to matter for the rest of the century, certainly till 2070.
OK, prosím, ptejte se. Pošleme mikrofon, prosím, zpátky. Povídejte.
Hi, I'm from Poland, neighbor. I'm a neighbor. Poland relies on coal, and Poland's under strong pressure from so-called international community, especially from the EU, to close all coal mines. Of course, they are not very effective. Of course, they pollute, but if we close them, it will hurt our economy and will slow the development of the country. If you are advisor of the Polish government, which direction shall such a country as Poland goes in terms of
Yep.
keeping or not keeping the...
What to concentrate on.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I think there's two things for Poland. I should just first preface, I don't know enough about Poland to make the exact case, but if you look at Germany, for instance, having coal mines is probably a fairly poor investment. They typically require lots of subsidies. They're incredibly unhealthy jobs. So you should try and separate, should Poland use coal and should Poland have coal miners? Probably you shouldn't have coal miners. You can make coal a lot cheaper and a lot more effective elsewhere. The second argument is, should Poland use coal? Certainly, you should think about what's the alternative cost. And as long as, for instance, the EU and many others are saying we don't want to do fracking, we don't want to have cheap gas, then coal is almost by definition the only real thing apart from nuclear power, which turns out to have a lot of its own issues, the only real cheap baseload power, unless you have hydro, which all countries have a little bit, but only few countries have a lot of. For instance, Norway and Sweden have lots of hydro, and so they're very close to carbon neutral, and they're incredibly proud of it and rubs it in our face all the time. But of course, that's because it's easy for them, right? But unless you have that, you will have to use coal for a long time. Now, the trick here is to recognize this is not about saying, oh, just go ahead and burn coal. This is about saying, let's get smarter opportunities. So let's find a way to transition Poland from coal to gas. Because in that way, you would cut your carbon emissions by half. That's very rough, and you can't do that because there's a lot of other stuff. But that's fundamentally the smart first move. So you should definitely look into getting fracking going, both in Poland, and make sure you get it across the EU, because that is by far the best way that we can cut carbon emissions in the short and medium term. It's a way that we can both cut emissions and actually get richer. That's a much, much better one than cut a little and get poorer. But in the long run, of course, you need to focus on technology. So what Poland should do is to say, look, we're going to keep using coal. We want to make sure there's two problems with coal. There's one that's CO2, but actually the much worse part of coal is the local air pollution. That's the thing that really kills people. And remember, it also kills Poles. So you should cut the air pollution from coal in Poland significantly. Use supercritical power plants that use less coal, have much better scrubbers, make sure that you really find state-of-the-art. And we have very good evidence to show that that is actually an incredibly good investment. It fundamentally makes sure that you burn less and that you kill fewer people. And then move to gas in the short run, and then invest a lot more in research and development into green energy, and make everyone else do that in EU as well, so that we actually have a solution in the next 20 to 40 years.
Concerning the investment, I quote your words, from a Wall Street Journal interview that was done in June 2016. You said that you support Mr. Gates, Bill Gates and the Breakthrough Coalition, because Mr. Gates said that private investors are committing $7 billion for green energy research and development. In your comment in USA Today in April this year, you said that Copenhagen Consensus on Climate found that we shouldn't just double R&D, but make a tenfold increase to reach at least $100 billion US. Where does this number come from? $100 billion.
You should always, when it's such a round number, you know it's not for real, right? I mean, it's a rough estimate of what we should get going.
That's why I'm asking, because you are saying I'm trying to bring the real stuff. That's why I'm asking for this real stuff. $100 billion.
It comes from a research paper by Chris Green and his associates from University of Guelph, where they did the world's first estimate of how much is the cost-benefit of investing in research and development. Remember, this is really, really hard to do, because we're talking about what's the benefit of doing stuff that we've never done before. Well, we have a lot of experience, because we've, for instance, done a lot of investment in medical research, and we now know how much was the benefit of that. Remember, the reason why the market doesn't work well with research and development is because if you're the guy who invests and find a really, really smart technology, by the time it's useful, it's typically out of date with your patent. So you've had all the costs, but you can't recoup all the benefits. That's why we need public spending, for instance, on medical research. That's why we have lots of people doing studies in universities on medical research, because it actually makes us all healthier, but it's hard to get private companies to do it. We need the same thing for green energy. Is it 100 billion? They argued that this is probably about the maximum that you can realistically do and still expect a lot of people to be able to work in this area. If you spent much more money, you would probably just end up driving up the cost, that is the salaries of these people. If you spend a lot less, you wouldn't be doing as much as you could for climate change. So it's a rough estimate on that.
Okay, it's an estimate.
Yes.
The number we saw concerning EU, it was $11, I believe.
Yes.
There was the graph 0.03 and $11. It's a rough estimate as well?
Oh, of course. There's no way that, look, this is an order of magnitude estimate, but it's crucial in the sense that we don't have this discussion. The question earlier was, how do you get people to work on data? If you get a sense of proportion, if I spend a corona on this, how much good do I do? And if you're told the current climate policies, you'll do 0.03 coronas. What is that? Do you have like a cent?
No, we don't.
Okay, yes. And likewise, if you spend it on research and development, you do 11. Look, that's not the true number, but it's
you are
close.
guessing that you will
Look,
gain
we
11. That's a guess. That's an estimate. As well as 0.03. That's just an estimate.
It's an estimate in the it's an estimate in the sense. And let me, now you've sort of asked me to give you the background. For the 0.03, we have 294 studies of the social cost of carbon dioxide. We know from the climate models how much the EU is actually going to reduce the temperature by itself from its climate policies, and we know how much the value of that is over the next 100 years. So we can actually reasonably well estimate that. But of course, remember, it still goes back to how much do we involve the issue of catastrophic outcomes, and we basically just take the median of these estimates. So it's a good estimate, but yes, it's only an estimate. But I would be much more worried if they were very close to each other, but they're not at all.
Okay. Další otázka, prosím, dejte se.
Hi, I'm Martin from Prague. I have two questions. The first one is, shall I understand it correctly that we should really pretty much give up on the temperature predictions and aims, and we should really rather adapt to the environment and to the heat and stuff by being smarter, even though it will be 4 degrees more in like 8 years?
Okay, we will answer that question. We will answer the first one. Yes or no?
No.
Why not?
And yes, thank you. So yes, we should definitely adapt, but I'm not actually saying we should stop trying to turn the curve down, but we shouldn't do it with the Paris policies, because Paris policies is essentially saying, let's take current technology that doesn't work and try to do a little bit to cut temperature. What I'm arguing is, find better technology by investing in research and development so that in the next 20 to 40 years, green energy becomes so cheap, everyone will want to buy it. And then we have good estimates, but again, these are much, much more guesses because we're talking about what will future technology bring. Then we have good reason to believe that we can dramatically drop temperature, because imagine, I'm just asking you to imagine this right now. For instance, Craig Venter, the guy who did the human genome back in 2000, he's working on making an algae that can produce oil. So basically take sunlight, produce oil, and it'll be CO2 neutral. I mean, that sounds incredibly cool. We have no idea whether, well, we probably think you can do it, but we have no idea whether you can do it anywhere close to cost effective. But imagine if that breakthrough came. Everyone would grow their own oil, and we would stop using oil in the sense of emitting CO2. That'd be great. Imagine a few of those breakthroughs. The point, of course, is if it was just Craig Venter and nobody else, then it would be a lot to trust on that one guy. But it's tens of thousands of research teams that come up with these kinds of ideas, and we just need a few of them to get the breakthrough. So no, I'm not saying just, let's give up. We should certainly look at adaptation, but the main point is to find a much smarter way to cut CO2.
Your second question?
My second is very different. If I know correctly, you lived, or you still live in Prague, right?
Yep.
For some, how is it? How do you like it here?
I love it. I mean,
Why do you love it? Why do you love it?
The simple answer is, every time I'm in Prague, I feel like I'm in a wonderland.
Really?
I've got to say that doesn't go when you sort of go out to outside of 1 and 2, but it's incredibly beautiful. People are very, very friendly. I live right by the Staroměstská, so it's Staroměstská.
Staroměstská, yes.
Sorry. Yeah,
That's
where I live.
Do you know
Yes.
the most important Czech word? The most important Czech word you have to know to make friends everywhere. And one most important sentence you have to know to make
Clearly
friends everywhere.
not. Clearly not.
One word
this
and
is,
one sentence.
Okay, give it to me.
The word is pivo,
Pivo?
beer,
Oh,
Pivo.
right, yes.
and the sentence is ještě jedno pivo, one more beer.
But I don't drink.
And really?
See,
yeah.
that's the sad part about it, right? Yes.
But
so
still,
no friends.
Despite that, you will have great friends, I believe,
Yes,
here in
yes.
Czech Republic, because not everyone is drinking just beer. And even though if he or she is, they will have no trouble to talk to you anyway. There's one more thing I would like to talk, and I would love to use it as maybe a small attraction, a small opening for your tomorrow's speech. Because I would like to talk about something that you, in the interview for Wall Street Journal, called, and I quote, philanthropist shopping list. Because you said, okay, here are some stuff that we have developed, some areas that we are supposed to concentrate on to make the greatest good. You have mentioned 4 of them. Get more free trade, get more contraceptives for women, nutrition, and vaccination. How much good can we do if we promote these particular areas?
So the simple answer, and if we could have the slide up, the last slide that's still on my computer, then I can show you what we did was we asked about 80 of the world's top economists, 82 actually, to look across all the different areas that the UN is looking at. And these are the outcomes that you can see up here. So you probably can't read this. This is free trade. So if we could get a successful Doha round, I don't know if any one of you remember, we actually started a free trade round back in 2001 in Doha, and it's still not concluded. 15 years later, it's really, really depressing. The reason why free trade is incredibly effective is because it allows everyone to do what they do best. And a good example is to go, for instance, to Bangladesh, where a lot of people, especially a lot of women, have been lifted out of poverty because they can sew your clothes. Now, they don't get paid a lot. I don't know if you remember, there was a Rana Plaza back in 2012 where a factory collapsed. It was terrible in many ways. But of course, most of the people that come in from the province want to get better, and they actually get that opportunity. They get better education, they get better nutrition for their kids because they start getting their own income, and they actually have an opportunity to do so. What we estimate is if you could get a successful Doha round, that's not free trade, it's simply slightly freer trade. The cost of doing that would be basically to pay off rich Western farmers. Farmers in the EU, farmers in the US. Those are the ones that primarily are against free trade. But the benefits would be phenomenal. We actually estimate the average person in the developing world, remember, the biggest benefits would go to people in the developing world. We actually estimate the average person in the developing world by 2030 would be making $1,000 more per person per year. That's almost doubling the income of most of the real poor people, so about the poorest 2 billion people in the world. And that's why we estimate that the benefit for every dollar spent, basically paying off rich Western farmers, would probably do about $2,000 worth of goods. So that's one of the answers to your question. Another one was gender. If we get contraception to women, about 215 million women lack contraception. If we could get that contraception to them, it would be beneficial in many different ways. Partly, fewer women would die. We estimate about 150,000 fewer women would die. That means about 600,000 kids would not lose their moms. We would have fewer kids dying because women who have access to contraception space their kids better, and so the kids themselves have less likelihood of dying. But also, crucially, because if you reduce the number of kids you have, which you almost inevitably will do if you use more contraception, you also have what the demographers call a demographic dividend. You basically have a situation for about a generation and a half where you have a youth bulge that goes through that becomes working age people. They produce a lot, but you have fewer kids and you have few old people, and so you have a lot of productivity in that society for a generation and a half. Then, of course, you get lots of old people, and we get the problem that everybody have in Europe. But for that generation and a half, you get higher productivity growth. We estimate that for every krona spent on contraception for women, you would do about 120 kronas of good for women here. If you look at immunization, one of the other things you talk about, we estimate that for about $1 billion, this is not us, this is Gavi, the Global Alliance for Vaccines, they estimate for about $1 billion more, we could save 1 million kids from dying each year in the world. We could basically make them survive, which of course would be huge benefits in almost all kinds of ways. We estimate for every dollar spent, you'd do about $60 worth of good. If you look at nutrition, that's the last one, and if you get kids better nutrition, it's not just morally good. I mean, no kids should be starving, but we also know that it's incredibly economically good, because if you get kids good food, especially from 0 to 2 years old, their brains develop more. They can actually get the nutrition to have their brains develop, which means that when they go to school, they learn more each year, and they actually stay longer in school. And so when they come out of school, they're much more productive. We now have long-term studies. I won't go into how we have obtained them, but actually from Guatemala, we now know that if you get better food when you're a small child, you will, on average, if you avoid being stunted, make 60% higher wages. So you'll simply be much more productive. And that's why we estimate for every dollar spent on food, you will do $45 worth of good for the world. So basically, wow, that was really, really poorly done. But anyway, sorry. So basically, that's one of the other. I really would like to be able to do that. Let me just try and do that, see if I can get that up again. Yeah.
You would have to click through it, yeah.
So, yeah, wow. Not quite sure why this is. There you go. So if you take a look at this, what you see, this nutrition was here. That was the $45. What you see here, there's an incredible number of really, really smart investments. Now, there's also some pretty dumb ones, and what I'm trying to say is, let's do the smart ones. We're a pretty advanced civilization. Let's look at where we can do the most good. If what we want to do, and that's again my point with climate change, most people want to do something about CO2 because it's a great way to make sure that you help people in the future. You want to leave a better planet. But CO2 is not the only knob that you can turn. And so let's have that conversation. Which of these many, many knobs do we want to spend? We don't have infinite amount of money, so let's spend it where we can do the most good. Investment in research and development in green energy is definitely a good investment, but there are also lots of other ones, and let's also remember to do those.
And keep in mind that this will just an opening of tomorrow's lecture. And you can be part of that. Part of the discussion here in the Meltingpot as a part of Colors of Ostara 2016. Bjørn Lomborg was your guest. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thanks, guys.